Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a book talk given at the University of Texas, Austin, by noted journalist and historian Tom Ricks under the sponsorship of the Clements Center. The talk is hosted by Paul Edgar, Associate Director of the Clements Center. Ricks is discussing his new book, First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. In his talk, Ricks outlines the degree to which our founding fathers were heavily influenced by the ancients, in particular the Romans, but in the case of Jefferson, especially with the Greeks, and how this influence helped to shape the structure and the principles of the emerging republic. It's a fascinating discussion. Let's listen in.
Hi, my name's Paul Edgar. I'm the Associate Director at the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Tom Ricks, who's going to talk about his book, First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. We encourage you to buy it and get the whole story, not just the highlights, which Tom is going to share with us today. Let me give just a couple of comments of introduction for Tom himself. Of course, many of you, if not all of you, already know who he is. You've seen him talk here at the University of Texas, with us, the Clements Center, perhaps in other places. He's a very prominent journalist and historian, but personally, I think it might be more accurate to describe Tom first and fundamentally as a historian for a few decades who disguised himself as a journalist. He disguised himself with respected outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, while on the side, publishing The Making of the Corps, Fiasco, The Gamble, The Generals, Churchill, and Orwell, and most recently, First Principles. This is a book that came out, I believe the hardback was published in November, so we're still fresh on the opening tour. Along the way, Tom became a trusted voice among policymakers in government and in think tanks. When a historian slash journalist does their work faithfully, I think when they report well, and we might say when they agitate constructively, that's often what happens. And that's certainly what happened with Tom. And again, you probably know all those things already. So let me tell just a little bit about Tom's work that you haven't heard, that you probably don't know about. And as members of the UT and Clements Center community, you should know about. For many years, Tom had his own very popular column with foreign policy called The Best Defense, and later moved it to Task and Purpose. I think there you called it The Long March, right? So he ran prominent popular columns with both of those publications. And during that time, Tom provided opportunities for many UT students and Clements Center fellows to publish public-facing scholarship related to foreign and military affairs. And he provided that opportunity for me, for one of our current postdoctoral fellows, Emily Whalen, and many, many others that you'll be familiar with as well. And for us, that was a big deal. It was our first time publishing in a prominent outlet for serious readers, and it helped us get our foot in the door for this kind of work. So we're grateful to Tom for that. Another way to put it, frankly, is that he took the time to invest in UT and Clements Center students. So thanks for that, Tom. Thanks for joining us today to talk about First Principles. We look forward to what you have to say.
You're welcome. It's great to be here virtually. It's a pleasure to talk to the UT community once again. I want to talk today about the founders of this country, the revolutionary generation, and the relationship to the ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans. We are today in this country surrounded by a buried world whose bones are evident to us, but whose meaning is not. By that I mean the signs of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Our Capitol building takes its name from a hill in Rome, the Capitoline Hill. The U.S. Senate, of course, is an imitation of the Roman Senate. If you take out the dollar bill, you'll see not just George Washington, but also Latin words on both sides. Ironic because Washington was the only one of our first four presidents who didn't read Latin or Greek. The names of many of our towns, especially towns founded in the late 18th century and early 19th century, come from the ancient world, most prominently names like Syracuse and Athens. Even the names of our two dominant political parties come from them. Democratic comes from the Greek, Republican comes from the Latin. This is because the Greeks and Romans were much more important to the people who invented this country than they are to us in America today. And the reason for that is when the founders designed our government, they looked around for examples to follow. There weren't many republics in history. Most governments historically have been monarchies or warrior chieftains, led by kings, queens, emperors. So there were only a few examples out there to go by. When they wrote the Constitution, they looked mainly to the ancient Greek city-states and even more to the Roman Republic. They took their political vocabulary from Rome, their belief in virtue, their fear of faction, and their hatred of corruption. For them, the central political narrative in all of history was the decline of the Roman Republic. One reason right now that each American state has two senators, no matter how big or small the state is because that is how one ancient Greek alliance of city-states worked, the amphictyonically. James Madison had spent years before the Constitutional Convention studying those arrangements. In fact, he and Jefferson, who was in Europe at the time, communicated about this, with Jefferson literally sending trunk loads of books to Madison back in Virginia so Madison could study and prepare for a constitutional convention. I also want to note here that the ancient world that they had was not the same as our ancient world. How can that be? They looked to different writers, to different figures. They had different estimations. They even looked in the order of Greece and Rome differently. We tend to look at the Greeks and Romans as the Greeks as philosophers and writers, and as the Romans who were rather dull soldiers who were good at building roads and aqueducts. The revolutionary generation had a very different view. They looked to Rome for law, for philosophy, especially for Stoicism, and for literature. Their favorite ancient dramatist was Terence. If any of you know who Terence is, I'd be impressed. Terence was a Roman comic playwright who no one reads today, and for good reason. I tried and I found him unreadable. But in the 18th century, he was considered the #1 dramatist of the ancient world. And for them, Rome is in the foreground, Greece is off in the background. When they did look at Greece, they preferred Sparta to Athens. Samuel Adams, the revolutionary cousin of the revolutionary John Adams, said at one point that he looked forward to Boston becoming the Sparta of the New World. We see Athens as the culmination of early Western civilization, full of great philosophers, dramatists, and orators. The founding generation saw Athens as kind of silly, overly turbulent. One historian wrote that it was like a ship without a captain. And in contrast to today, when we see the Greek tragedians as some of the world's great literature, very few in the revolutionary generation read much of those ancient Greek dramatists. One of them who did was Thomas Jefferson, and again you find Jefferson is the exception. He is the Greek among the other founders, the other early presidents, who are all much more Roman. I'll come back to that. The first of the four presidents, of course, is George Washington. Interestingly, Washington is the most Roman of the bunch. This is ironic because, as I said, he didn't read Latin or Greek, or for that matter, French or German or Italian. He was relatively uneducated. And at one point in 1791, John Adams and another member of Washington's cabinet had a quiet conversation over drinks about whether Washington was illiterate. And Thomas Pickering said, oh, he is. He really can't write. And John Adams says, well, I was in Congress during the Revolution, and I got very good letters from Washington. And Pickering says dismissively, oh, no, those were written by that kid, Hamilton. Washington strove to rise in the elite culture of his day, even though he was relatively uneducated. He was an intelligent man with great energy and ambition. And he, I think, absorbed the neoclassical culture from the American elite culture of the day. For example, Washington's favorite play was Cato, about the Roman statesman who vigorously opposed the rise of Julius Caesar and indeed committed suicide rather than submit to Caesar. Washington is said to have loved the play Cato so much that he had it put on at Valley Forge by some of his soldiers. And it's interesting, nobody reads the play today, but all of you will recognize a couple of lines from that play. One is when a character regrets that he has but one life to give to Rome. And another is when Cato, near the end of the play, says, give me liberty or give me death. Washington made Cato his role model. Cato's characteristics were prudent. He was prudent, restrained, wise, frugal, careful. These are the characteristics that Washington emulated and, I would argue, brought to the presidency and established some of the norms of what we expect from an American president, especially that restraint, that being above the fray. This was nowhere in the Constitution said that that's the way that the president should act, but it's how Washington began to shape the office of the presidency when he was the first occupant. Washington is followed by John Adams. John Adams is a very different character. He was much less restrained. He wore his heart on his sleeve. I think he would like to think of himself as a Stoic, but he was more a Stoic wannabe. He was a big whiner in a lot of ways. I'm saying this with the consciousness that I think John Adams has enjoyed an inflated reputation in recent years because of the David McCullough biography and then the subsequent HBO miniseries. A very enjoyable miniseries, but I don't think John Adams was the teddy bear that Paul Giamatti portrayed him as. He was not a teddy bear. He was a good revolutionary, but a lousy president. His great accomplishment was that he kept us out of war with France, and that was important. But he also believed that it was illegal to criticize the president himself, John Adams, and that to be partisan was to be factionalist, and to be a factionalist was to be close to treasonous. Why does he do this? Well, John Adams wanted to be the American Cicero. Cicero, the great Roman politician and orator who condemns the Catiline conspiracy, the four speeches that everybody who was in school, advanced schooling in the 18th century, studied. Cicero was all about stability, and so was Adams as president. He was terrified of faction. He wanted stability, and in the 1790s, it was a very turbulent time, and he had a difficult time as president. He thought his job was to avoid the fate of the Romans, the collapse of the Republic, the takeover by Julius Caesar, the rise of the monarchy. And so he sought to crack down on anybody who smacked of factionalism. He threw dozens of newspaper editors into jail simply for criticizing. Jefferson and Madison are interesting. They're good buddies. They come along, and they're not so bothered by factionalism. They form the early opposition to Adams and to Hamilton. They develop the early rudiments of our first political party in the 1790s, and they're very successful. By 1800, Jefferson wins the presidency, leading this opposition. And I have a lot of problems with Jefferson as well, I think the Declaration of Independence is a great document, and I think his other great achievement was his first inaugural address. And he comes in, and that first inaugural address effectively repeals what Adams has done. Jefferson says two important things in that first inaugural. Number one, he says, not all differences of opinion are differences of principle. That is, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't make them a bad person. The second thing he says is, I'm not going to throw the opposition into jail. I'm going to let people debate in the public forum, and if our ideas are good, then they will win. And if our ideas are bad, our policies are bad, they will lose. As I said, Jefferson is a real exception among the first four presidents. He is the Greek. He liked to read Euripides, unusual at the time. He even liked Athens more than Sparta, which was even more unusual. He was not a Stoic. He was much more Epicurean from the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who had the philosophy that in life we should pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And this was the purpose of life. You can see that Epicureanism reflected in his draft of the Declaration of Independence, with its emphasis high up twice on the prudent pursuit of happiness. And while we've all been taught that John Locke had great influence, I think Montesquieu, the French philosopher, had more influence on this generation. And in fact, they refer to Montesquieu twice as much in their letters and pamphlets and diaries than they do to John Locke. There is one very important phrase of Locke's that is reflected in the Declaration. Locke had written about life, liberty, and the state. And Jefferson makes a fascinating substitute. He takes life and liberty, but then he makes it, of course, the pursuit of happiness. It's a massive expansion of the franchise. The purpose of the state is not just to protect life, liberty, and property, which property belonging to just a few. Rather, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody can pursue happiness in some form. It really is a revolutionary change done very subtly. And I think this is, in its essence, Epicurean. In lesser ways, I think Jefferson also is very Epicurean in that it allows him to live in contradictions. He is a philosopher of liberty who lives off the sweat of captive humans. And he kind of hides them in the basement. Monticello is supposedly a fabulous piece of architecture. I have to say, his house, Monticello, that he designed gives me the creeps because he preserves slavery, but he buries it under the ground. He tries to make slavery what it is, part of the daily operation, but it's hidden. So, for example, even in his dining room, he is a dumbwaiter. So he doesn't have to have a slave servant standing by. Rather, he can just ring a bell and the food is sent up in a little elevator from the hidden kitchens in the basement. I think also this philosophy of pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain explains Jefferson's lifelong pursuit of married women. He loved beautiful, intelligent women who were married. Throughout his life, he's pitched and wooed that way. And I think this is partly because he wants all the fun of romance and none of the worries of actually having to be serious about it and get married. Being Epicurean, I think, you see it at most in his own hypocrisy. And I think this is the biggest problem I have with Jefferson. Of all the founders, you have the biggest discrepancy between his words and actions. Other founders supported slavery, owned enslaved people, but he's the one who talks a good game about slavery in Paris and then comes home to Virginia and does nothing about it. Madison, I'm fascinated by. I don't think Madison gets enough credit. I think he's second only to Washington among the founders. Washington, as a general, won the war that gave us the country. Madison comes along and designs the country. He is the most influential person in getting a constitutional convention together. At the Constitutional Convention, we're discussing how to structure to restructure America from this Articles of Confederation government they had in the 1780s. And he, along with Hamilton, plays the leading role in getting the Constitution ratified by the states. Madison, to prepare for the convention, spent years reading ancient history, sitting in the second floor of his parents' house, Montpelier, about 20 miles northeast of Charlottesville, Virginia, looking out from this window of a library over the Blue Ridge in Shenandoah and reading ancient Greek and Roman history. What were the constitutions of the Greek republics? What were the structures of these confederations? Then, in the Federalist Paper, Hamilton and Madison refer hundreds of times to ancient texts. Surprisingly, given how Roman the founding generation was, these somewhat younger guys, Hamilton and Madison, refer more to Greece in the Federalist Papers than they do to Rome. This is mainly because of Madison's interest in the ancient Greek city-states. I think it's also because Hamilton and Madison both were rather impatient with state orientation. I would argue that they were both nationalists, more Americans than members of states. Of course, Hamilton comes from overseas. He doesn't have a state of origin. But even Madison strikes me as more an American than a Virginian. You see this early on when Madison chooses not to go to William and Mary, but instead to a college in another colony, Princeton, which was the most politicized of the colleges of the time, the most radical. It was really the Berkeley of 200 years earlier, and was national in its orientation, whereas Harvard and Yale and William and Mary drew students mainly from their own colonies. Princeton expressly recruited students from the entire Atlantic seaboard up into Canada and down into the West Indies. At Princeton, interestingly, Madison was taught primarily by John Witherspoon, a Scottish cleric, and the first college president to come from overseas to the American colonies. And we have the lecture notes that students took from Witherspoon's lectures. One of them is about checks and balances. Clearly, Madison listened well to that lecture. So in the 1790s, I think Madison, along with Jefferson, plays another key role in developing the first opposition political party. And I think he saw the strategic context, just as Washington plays a key role as a general, as the commanding general of the U.S. Army, and sees what he needs to do to win the war. I think Madison has the great strategic insight in the late 1780s, early 1790s. We have to have an opposition party here. We have to embrace partisanship. Just as in the Constitution, they reject relying on virtue, and Madison seeks to balance interest with interest, even vice with vice, by dispersing power. So in the 1790s, Madison and Jefferson combined to create the early rudimentary political party. I want to talk a moment about slavery. The ancient world had slavery, and the colonial slaveholders relied on that fact quite a lot. They did not, though, focus on the fact that Roman and Greek slavery generally was very different from the American system. First of all, anyone taken captive in the ancient world could wind up a slave, and a slave could be freed, and the children of a freed slave could hold public office. But the biggest difference between ancient slavery and the American system of slavery was that the ancient slavery was not based on race. There were slaves of all colors in the ancient world and slaveholders of all colors. They saw slavery as a result of misfortune, not the result of having a certain skin color. Unfortunately, the founders wrote the American system of slavery into the fundamental law of the land, the Constitution. They passed it on, and less than 100 years after the American Revolution, the country fell into a civil war. This was followed by a Reconstruction Reconstruction that very quickly was suppressed by the South. White supremacism was reinstalled. Blacks were disenfranchised. And I think it's something we are still struggling with in this country. I think we've had a long Reconstruction, and that there are still people in this country who don't endorse the basic idea that all Americans have equal rights before the law. And unfortunately, some of the people who believe that are wearing police uniforms. So what happened to this classicism that so dominated the thinking of the revolutionary generation? Well, the fact is that in the early 19th century, there was another revolution in America, a social revolution. And this was started, I think, by the Constitution, mainly. The Constitution states at the beginning that we, the people, are in charge. And the people took that idea and they ran with it. And they did away with classicism pretty quickly. They said, if we're in charge, we're going to have a free market in ideas, a free market in religion, and a free market in culture. And it turns out they were much more interested in steamboats and railroads than they were in Plato or Socrates. So if the founders came back today, I think they would be first embarrassed by how the repercussions of slavery still haunt this country. They would be embarrassed that they didn't do a better job. In their defense, I would say that one school says that you should look at the Constitution not just as a law of the land, but also as a peace treaty between states. The people writing the Constitution knew and had been told by Georgia and South Carolina that if there were any whiff of getting rid of slavery, that Georgia and South Carolina would pull out, that they would not be part of the United States. And so they were desperate to keep those states in, not because they were big, but because if they were not part of the United States, it would give foreign powers a toehold right adjacent to this new country. So there's this whip of secession early on that never quite goes away. And even today, I think there's still a bit of nullification floating around out there in some of the southern states. Overall, though, I think they would be pleased to see that the United States has held together. One of the questions that haunted them was that Montesquieu, a very influential philosopher, and how they thought about it. Montesquieu really designs the modern liberal democratic state based on tolerance, based on a balancing liberty and order, based on having diverse views and a dispersion of power. But Montesquieu also said the republics have to be small, like city-states, and that it's hard to sustain them. Somehow, Madison and the others managed to design a continental republic that has lasted 250 years. I think they'd be very pleased with that. I'm a little bit surprised. But I think they'd also have some questions for us. First of all, Madison would say, all this talk about gridlock, guys, that's a feature, not a bug. We designed the dispersal of power. We have checks and balances. We have 3 branches of federal government. We have 2 houses in the legislative branch, and we have powers also dispersed to the states. This all means that if you people can't compromise, the system freezes, and that's better than going to war. I think one of the things that would bother them most these days is money in politics, how we fund elections. They would have been appalled, I think, at how money dominates our politics, and especially how corporations and the rich control the financing of campaigns. I don't think all of them would have been. Some of them, especially the wealthier Southerners, would have said that's fine. I think Jefferson and Madison, though, especially would say that Wall Street, that the financial world has much too much power over Congress. Some of them, I think most of them, would also say our democracy these days is in danger of becoming an oligarchy that is ruled by the rich, and would say that we have let the rich have much too much say in American politics, and That's one reason why, over the last 40 years, the top 1% of wealth holders in America have captured all the gains in productivity, while middle-class income has flatlined for the last 40 years. I think finally, the founders would look at us and wonder why we haven't paid more attention to a phrase that occurs twice in the Constitution, the general welfare. Interestingly, twice they refer to the common defense and the general welfare. I spent my life writing about the common defense, and it's a phrase we hear often. We don't hear as much about the general welfare. What they meant by that was the public good. Rights are not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. And these are things especially that don't have internal borders. Things like clean air, clean water, things like the transportation infrastructure or public education. Something really notable in the last year of our history in this country is another public good, public health. This is not something that can be private property. And interestingly, it's not something that really responds well to 50 different responses by 50 different governors. It's something that required more of a central response, a coordinated, well-run federal response that we didn't see under the Trump administration, which is one reason that so many people died of the virus. I think they would tell us to think more about the public good, a phrase which, by the way, occurs over 1,000 times in their writings. I think as part of that, they'd also tell us to put less emphasis on property rights of the individual and more on the rights of the people as a whole. And they would say the market should have a say, especially about business dealings. But the market should not be the ultimate determinant of how we live, or should be allowed to shape our society, especially on issues of the public good.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.